My girlfriend wrote to me, "We are breaking up. I deserve better, and I am flying to Bahamas with my new boyfriend." I did not reply to her, so she thought that was the end, but she had no idea that he was my new employee. While they were already enjoying their flight, I texted my employee, "You are fired," after which I blocked his card. And the very next day at 6 in the morning, my phone exploded with calls. So here's the thing about being a 30-year-old VP at a major software company in LA. People think they know what that means, but they really don't. My name's Aaron, and I've been grinding my way up the corporate ladder for 8 years straight. Started as a junior developer, making barely enough to afford ramen and a studio apartment in Burbank. Now I'm pulling in 6 figures, managing a team of 40-plus people, and living in a decent place in West Hollywood. The American dream, right? Well, that's what I thought until last Tuesday morning changed everything. My girlfriend Melanie had been with me for 2 years. We met at some networking event downtown. She worked at a boutique marketing agency, always dressed sharp, always had big dreams about traveling the world and living the Instagram lifestyle. You know the type. She knew I had a good job and made decent money. But honestly, she never really understood what I actually did. When people asked, she'd just say I worked in tech and managed some people. Simple as that. I never felt the need to brag or get into the nitty-gritty details of my responsibilities. Melanie was always scrolling through social media, looking at influencers in Dubai, couples on yacht trips, fancy dinners at restaurants that cost more than most people's rent. She'd make little comments here and there about how we never did anything exciting, how we always stayed local, how other couples seemed to be living so much better. Truth is, I was being smart with my money, saving up, thinking long-term. Maybe a ring, maybe a down payment on a house, definitely planning for our future together. But apparently, that practical approach wasn't moving fast enough for her taste. Last Tuesday started like any other day. I'm making my morning coffee. That overpriced Trader Joe's stuff that makes you feel fancy without completely destroying your budget, when my phone buzzes on the kitchen counter. Text message from Melanie. She usually sent good morning messages, so nothing seemed unusual at first. I picked up the phone expecting some cute emoji or maybe a complaint about her commute. Instead, I got a novel. The message started with how she'd been thinking about us, about her life, about what she really wanted. Then it got into how she'd found someone who truly deserved her, someone who understood her ambitions and wasn't afraid to dream big. She went on about how this new guy was incredibly successful, a real go-getter who was already making major moves in the business world. According to her, he had connections everywhere and was destined for greatness. The way she described him, you'd think she discovered the next Elon Musk hiding in plain sight. Then came the kicker. He was taking her on a luxury vacation to the Bahamas, flying out Friday, staying at some 5-star resort for an entire week. The whole VIP treatment. She ended the message by saying she needed to be with someone who matched her energy and ambition, someone who could give her the life she deserved. She wished me well and hoped I'd understand that this was what was best for both of us. I stood there in my kitchen, coffee mug in one hand, phone in the other, just staring at the screen. 2 years together. And this is how it ends? A breakup text talking about some mystery man who apparently had everything I didn't? The weird thing was, I wasn't angry. Not yet, anyway. I was more confused. Melanie always seemed happy with our relationship. Sure, she complained about wanting to travel more, but I thought we were solid. We talked about moving in together, maybe getting a dog, normal couple stuff. Now suddenly there's this perfect guy who swooped in and offered her everything she ever wanted. It felt like a movie plot. Honestly. Too convenient. Too perfectly timed. I set my phone down and finished making my coffee, trying to process what just happened. Part of me wanted to call her, demand an explanation, maybe even fight for the relationship. But another part of me, the logical business part, was already asking questions. Who was this guy? How did they meet? And how exactly did someone get so successful so fast that they could just drop money on luxury Bahamas trips like it was nothing? The timing bothered me too. Melanie had been acting a little different lately, staying late at work more often, being protective of her phone, mentioning new people at industry events. I'd chalked it up to job stress, but now I was wondering if there was more to it. As I got ready for work, one thought kept nagging at me. In L.A., in the tech and business world, everybody knows everybody eventually. Successful young professionals don't just appear out of nowhere. They have histories, connections, mutual acquaintances. This mystery Prince Charming had to come from somewhere. And in a city where networking is everything, there was a decent chance our paths had crossed before, even if I didn't realize it yet. I grabbed my keys and headed out the door, still processing the whole situation. The morning commute gave me time to think, and by the time I got to the office, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to chase after Melanie or beg her to reconsider. If she wanted to leave, that was her choice. But I was definitely curious about this new guy of hers. Call it professional interest, call it human nature. I wanted to know who I was supposedly losing to. Little did I know, the answers were going to be much closer to home than I expected. And when I finally figured out who this successful businessman really was, everything was going to make a lot more sense. The office was buzzing with typical Tuesday energy when I walked in, but my mind was still stuck on that breakup text. I went through the motions, checking emails, reviewing project updates, pretending like my personal life hadn't just imploded via text message. Around 10 a.m., I was in a budget review meeting when my phone lit up with Instagram notifications. Normally, I'd ignore social media during work hours, but something made me check. Big mistake. There was Melanie, posting stories like her life depended on it. Photos of expensive luggage, screenshots of first-class boarding passes, pictures of champagne glasses with captions about new beginnings, and finally living my best life. But the real punch to the gut came in the third story. She'd posted a photo of her in some guy's hands. His watch was clearly visible, some flashy thing that probably cost more than my monthly rent. The caption read something about being grateful for real men who know how to treat a queen. I stared at that watch for a solid minute. It looked familiar, but I couldn't place it. Then Jessica from accounting walked by my office, and something clicked. She mentioned that Derek from my team had been showing off some new Rolex he'd bought over the weekend. Said he was bragging about finally being able to afford the finer things in life. Derek. That name hit me like a freight train. 3 months ago, we hired Derek Martinez fresh out of USC's business school. Kid had all the right credentials on paper, good grades, internship at some consulting firm. Could talk a good game during interviews. He joined my team as a business development associate, which is basically entry-level with a fancy title to make MBA graduates feel important. From day one, Derek was intense, always perfectly dressed, always networking, always talking about his connections and the big deals he was going to close. The guy treated our weekly team meetings like he was pitching to venture capitalists. But here's the thing, and this is where my corporate experience comes in handy. I can spot ambition from a mile away. There's the good kind that drives people to work harder and learn more. And then there's a hollow kind that's all flash and no substance. Derek was definitely the latter. He'd name-drop people he'd supposedly met at industry events, talk about partnerships he was developing, and always seemed to have inside information about deals that never materialized. Classic case of fake it till you make it. Except he was all fake and no making it. The pieces started falling into place. Our company's summer mixer back in July. That's where Derek met Melanie. I introduced myself, just being polite, making small talk. But I remembered how Derek's whole demeanor changed when he found out she was my girlfriend. He got extra charming, started asking her about her work, complimenting her dress. At the time, I thought it was just networking. In LA's business scene, everyone's always working an angle, building connections. But looking back, the guy was definitely more interested in her than in professional courtesy. Over the next few weeks after that mixer, Derek started asking weird questions. Casual stuff about my role at the company, what kind of access I had, how the budget approvals worked. I figured he was just trying to understand the corporate hierarchy, maybe looking for advancement opportunities. Then there were the random comments about Melanie. He'd ask how she was doing, mention that he'd seen her at some industry event, always finding ways to bring her up in conversation. Again, seemed innocent enough at the time. But now, staring at that Instagram story, everything made perfect sense. The timeline, the expensive watch, the mysterious, successful businessman who supposedly swept Melanie off her feet. It was Derek all along. The irony was almost funny. Melanie left me for a guy who worked for me, thinking she was trading up. Derek was playing the part of a successful executive while being an entry-level employee whose salary was probably half of what I made on a bad year. I pulled up Derek's employee file on my computer. Sure enough, his start date was early May, which meant he'd been working here for barely 4 months. His salary was decent for someone his age, but nothing close to luxury vacation in the Bahamas money. The guy was living in a studio apartment in Koreatown and driving a leased BMW that he probably couldn't actually afford. But somehow he'd convinced my girlfriend that he was this big-shot businessman ready to take her on the trip of a lifetime. That's when it hit me, the company credit card. As part of his onboarding, I'd authorized a corporate card for Derek. It was standard procedure for business development roles, meant for client dinners, travel expenses, legitimate business costs. The spending limit was pretty generous, too, because we trusted our employees to use it responsibly. But what if Derek wasn't being responsible? What if he'd been using company money to fund his fake lifestyle? I logged into our expense management system and pulled up Derek's corporate card activity. What I saw made my coffee taste bitter. Charges at high-end restaurants downtown. Purchases at luxury clothing stores. And then, just yesterday, 2 first-class tickets to Nassau, Bahamas, along with a hotel reservation at some resort that cost more per night than most people make in a week. This kid had used company money, my company's money, to steal my girlfriend. The audacity was almost impressive, if it wasn't so incredibly stupid. Derek had no idea that I could see every transaction he made. He probably thought the card statements went to some anonymous accounting department that nobody would notice or care about his spending as long as he didn't go completely overboard. What he didn't realize was that as a VP, I had access to real-time spending alerts and detailed expense reports for everyone on my team. It's called fiscal responsibility, something they apparently didn't teach at his fancy business school. I sat back in my chair and started laughing. Not the fun kind of laughing, the kind you do when the universe serves you irony on a silver platter. Melanie thought she was upgrading to someone more successful and ambitious. Derek thought he was outsmarting the system and stealing the boss's girl. Neither of them had any idea they were about to learn some very expensive lessons about corporate hierarchy and personal consequences. I looked at the calendar on my desk. Tuesday morning, flight leaving Friday. That gave me 3 days to decide how I wanted to handle this situation. I could report Derek to HR immediately, get him fired, and let the chips fall where they may. Or I could get creative. The thing about being in a position of authority is that you learn patience. Sometimes the best move isn't the obvious one. Sometimes you wait, you plan, and you let people dig their own graves a little deeper before you hand them the shovel. Derek and Melanie were about to have the vacation of a lifetime, and I was going to make sure it was memorable for all the right reasons. The next 2 days felt like the longest 48 hours of my life, but not because I was heartbroken or angry. I was methodical, calculating, running scenarios in my head like I was planning a product launch. Corporate training teaches you to think strategically, and this situation required some serious strategy. Wednesday morning. I did what any responsible VP would do. I called a meeting with Derek to discuss his recent performance and upcoming projects. Nothing unusual there, just normal management stuff. Derek walked into my office wearing another expensive shirt and that ridiculous watch, acting like butter wouldn't melt in his mouth. We talked about his client outreach efforts, his progress on the Johnson account. Typical work stuff. The whole time, he's sitting there probably thinking about his romantic weekend getaway, funded by the very company where he's lying to my face. The conversation was surreal. Here's this kid, barely out of college, who thinks he's pulled off some master plan to steal my girlfriend and live like a king on corporate money. Meanwhile, I'm sitting across from him knowing exactly what he's done, having access to every transaction, every lie, every fraudulent charge. But I kept it professional. Asked him about his expense reports, whether he had any upcoming business travel planned. Derek actually had the nerve to look me straight in the eye and say he was planning a networking trip to Miami over the weekend. a networking trip, to Miami. The guy's creativity was almost admirable. After he left my office, I spent the afternoon documenting everything. Screenshots of his corporate card statements, copies of the hotel and flight reservations, timestamps showing when the charges were made. In corporate America, documentation is everything. You can't just fire someone based on suspicion. You need a paper trail that will hold up in court. The beauty of Derek's plan was also its fatal flaw. He'd been so focused on impressing Melanie that he'd gotten sloppy with covering his tracks. The Bahamas resort reservation was made during business hours from his work computer. The flight charges went through while he was logged into our company network. Every move he made left digital breadcrumbs, leading right back to fraud charges. Thursday evening, I was at home planning my next move when Melanie posted another Instagram story. This time it was her suitcase, packed with new designer clothes, and a caption about how excited she was for her first taste of the luxury lifestyle. That's when I decided to get creative with the timing. See, Derek had made one crucial mistake in his planning. He'd booked everything for a Friday departure, but he hadn't requested the time off through proper channels. As far as our HR system was concerned, Derek was supposed to be in the office Friday morning for our weekly team meeting. I could have shut down his corporate card immediately, left him stranded at LAX with a canceled flight, and no way to pay for the hotel. But that felt too easy, too quick. I wanted Derek and Melanie to really understand the consequences of their choices. So I waited. Friday morning came, and obviously Derek was a no-show for our team meeting. I made a note of his unexcused absence, added it to his file, and watched the corporate card charges roll in throughout the day. Airport parking, overpriced coffee, duty-free shopping. The kid was living it up. The flight left LAX at 2:30 p.m. Pacific time. I tracked it online, watching as they flew across the country toward their tropical paradise. By the time they landed in Nassau around 10 p.m. Eastern, they were probably feeling pretty good about themselves. That's when I made my move. First, I called our corporate car company and reported fraudulent charges. I had all the documentation ready. The personal nature of the expenses, the lack of business justification, the fact that Derek had lied about the purpose of his travel. The card was frozen within 10 minutes. Then I sent Derek an email with copies to HR and our legal department. Professional, straightforward, no emotion whatsoever. The subject line was simple: immediate termination for expense fraud. The message was equally direct. Due to unauthorized personal use of company credit cards totaling over $8,000, Derek's employment was terminated effective immediately. His corporate car was canceled, his access to company systems revoked, and he had 72 hours to return any company property. I also mentioned that we'd be pursuing full reimbursement for all fraudulent charges, and that the matter was being referred to our legal team for possible criminal prosecution. Standard corporate language, but it gets the point across. The beautiful thing about time zones is that while it was 11 p.m. in the Bahamas when I sent that email, Derek and Melanie were probably just settling into their overpriced hotel room, maybe ordering room service, planning their week of luxury. By midnight Eastern time, Derek's corporate card was completely dead. No more charges, no more cash advances, no more funding for their fairy tale vacation. I'll admit, I stayed up later than usual that night, wondering when they'd figure out what happened. Would it be when they tried to pay for dinner? Maybe when Derek attempted to withdraw cash for beach activities. Or perhaps they'd sleep in Saturday morning and not realize until checkout time that their plastic paradise had turned into a very real problem. Saturday morning, my phone started buzzing around 6 a.m. Pacific time, 9 a.m. in Nassau. Multiple missed calls from a number I didn't recognize. Probably Derek trying to reach me from some hotel phone or borrowed cell. Then came the text messages. Derek's personal phone, frantically asking what happened to his corporate card, claiming there must be some mistake with the system. The desperation in his messages was palpable. This was a guy who just realized his house of cards was collapsing in real time. But the real entertainment came from Melanie's social media. Her Instagram story from earlier that morning showed a fancy breakfast spread with mimosas and tropical fruit. The caption was all about feeling grateful and blessed. By noon, the tone had changed dramatically. Vague posts about unexpected challenges and how true character shows during difficult times. No more photos of luxury meals or crystal-clear beaches. I didn't respond to Derek's increasingly frantic messages. Why would I? The guy had committed fraud, lied to his employer, and tried to steal my girlfriend using company money. He made his bed. Now he could lie in it, preferably on the beaches of Nassau with no way to pay for anything. The weekend stretched out ahead of them. 5 more days in paradise with frozen credit and no way home except whatever money they brought in cash. I imagined Derek trying to explain to Melanie how his corporate card suddenly stopped working, how this definitely wasn't his fault, how he'd figure something out. What made it even better was knowing Derek's salary. After taxes and his expensive LA lifestyle, the kid was probably living paycheck to paycheck. His personal savings might cover a few cheap meals and maybe a bus ride to the airport, but definitely not a week at a 5-star resort. The irony was perfect. Derek had used my company's money to steal my girlfriend, convinced her he was some successful businessman, and now they were stuck together in paradise with the truth slowly sinking in. By Sunday evening, Derek's messages had stopped. Either he'd figured out there was no point in begging, or his phone had died and he couldn't afford to charge at hotel rates. Either way, Operation Sandcastle was proceeding exactly as planned. Monday morning felt different. I walked into the office knowing that somewhere in the Bahamas, Derek and Melanie were probably having the worst vacation of their lives. The corporate card had been frozen for 3 days, which meant they'd burned through whatever cash Derek had brought, assuming he'd planned that far ahead. My assistant Jennifer knocked on my office door around 9, with a stack of weekend emails that needed attention. Most of it was routine stuff, but buried in there was a gem, an automated notification from our corporate travel insurance. Apparently, Derek had tried to file an emergency claim for early flight changes, citing a family emergency back home. The insurance company was requesting documentation and approval from his direct supervisor, which would be me, before processing any payments. I had to laugh. Even stranded in paradise, the kid was still trying to scam the system. I marked the claim as denied and moved on with my day. Around lunchtime, my phone rang. Unknown number with a Nassau area code. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to what might have been the most pathetic message I've ever received. Derek's voice was strained, barely holding it together. He claimed there was some kind of technical error with his corporate card. Begged me to call the credit card company to straighten things out. Promised he'd explain everything when he got back to the office. The desperation was thick enough to cut with a knife. What made it even more satisfying was hearing Melanie's voice in the background, clearly agitated, asking who he was calling and why this was taking so long to fix. The fairy tale was officially over. I deleted the voicemail and went back to work. Tuesday brought more entertainment. Our HR director, Sandra, stopped by my office with Derek's termination paperwork. She'd reviewed the evidence I compiled. The fraudulent charges, the unauthorized time off, the attempts to file false insurance claims, and agreed that immediate termination was not only justified but necessary. Sandra mentioned that Derek's final paycheck would be garnished to begin recovering the fraudulent expenses, and that our legal team was considering whether to press criminal charges. In corporate America, stealing $8,000 isn't a minor mistake. It's a career-ending felony. But the best part of Tuesday was Melanie's social media meltdown. Her Instagram story started around noon Eastern Time with cryptic messages about betrayal and lies, how people aren't always who they pretend to be. Then came the real breakdown. Posts about being stuck somewhere with someone who'd been lying about everything, about feeling trapped and deceived. By evening, she'd posted a long, rambling caption about learning hard lessons about trust and how desperate people will say anything to impress others. No mention of Derek by name, but anyone reading between the lines could figure out her Prince Charming had turned into a fraud. Wednesday morning brought my favorite phone call of the entire saga. Melanie called from her own phone, not Derek's, which told me everything I needed to know about the current state of their relationship. Her voice was different, smaller, defeated, nothing like the confident woman who'd sent me that breakup text 6 days earlier. She asked if we could talk, said she made a terrible mistake, and was sorry about how everything happened. When I asked where she was calling from, there was a long pause before she admitted she was still in Nassau, but things hadn't gone as planned. Apparently, Derek had finally come clean about his job, his salary, and the fact that he'd been using company money to fund their lifestyle. Melanie found out she'd left a VP for an entry-level employee who'd committed fraud to impress her. The reality check must have been brutal. She wanted to know if there was any way Derek could get his job back, if maybe we could work out some kind of payment plan for the money he'd spent. The desperation in her voice was almost sad, but I felt zero sympathy. These were the consequences of their choices. I told her Derek's employment was permanently terminated, and that he was lucky we hadn't filed criminal charges yet. As for their current situation, that sounded like a personal problem they'd need to solve together. Thursday was quiet, which probably meant they'd found some way to cut their losses and head home early. I imagined them sitting in coach on some budget airline. Derek tried to explain how he was going to rebuild his career after being fired for fraud. Melanie realizing she'd blown up her life for absolutely nothing. The silence was almost disappointing after several days of frantic calls and desperate messages. But sometimes the aftermath is quieter than the explosion. Friday marked exactly 1 week since their original departure date. I was in a budget meeting when Jennifer knocked on the conference room door with an urgent message. Melanie was in the lobby, asking to see me. My first instinct was to have security escort her out. What was there to talk about? She'd made her choice, Derek had made his, and they'd both learned some expensive lessons about honesty and consequences. But curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to see the aftermath firsthand, to witness what was left after their house of cards collapsed. When I got to the lobby, Melanie looked like she'd aged 5 years in 1 week. Her expensive vacation clothes looked wrinkled and tired. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she had a hollow-eyed look of someone who'd been crying for days. She asked if we could go somewhere private to talk, said she had things to explain and apologies to make. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop down the street after work that evening. Sitting across from my ex-girlfriend in a generic Starbucks, I listened to the full story of their nightmare vacation. Derek had managed to hide the truth for almost 3 days, convincing Melanie that the card issues were just technical problems that would be resolved soon. They'd been eating at cheaper restaurants, avoiding expensive activities, but still burning through his limited cash reserves. When the corporate card was declined to the 3rd day running, Derek finally broke down and confessed everything. His real job, his real salary, the fraud charges, the fact that he'd been fired via email while they were sipping cocktails by the pool. Melanie described the fight that followed as epic. She'd realized she'd been played by someone making a fraction of my salary, someone who committed crimes to afford their fake lifestyle. The successful businessman she'd left me for was actually a broke graduate student who'd maxed out stolen corporate credit to impress her. They'd spent their last 2 days in paradise sleeping in a hotel lobby after being kicked out of their room, eating vending machine snacks, and arguing about how to get home with no money. Derek's parents eventually wired enough cash for 2 economy flights back to LAX, but the relationship was obviously over. They'd barely spoken during the flight home, and Melanie had moved back in with her roommate, while Derek presumably went home to figure out his legal situation. As she finished her story, Melanie looked at me with tears in her eyes and asked the question I'd been waiting for. Could we try again? Could she come back? She promised she'd learned her lesson, that she understood what she'd given up, that Derek had been a mistake she'd regret forever. She swore she'd never take me or our relationship for granted again. I stirred my coffee and considered her request, knowing exactly what my answer would be. Sitting in that Starbucks, looking at Melanie's tear-stained face, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Complete emotional clarity. Not anger, not sadness. Just crystal clear understanding of exactly who I was dealing with and what needed to happen next. She kept apologizing, explaining how Derek had manipulated her, how she'd been swept up in promises of luxury and adventure. According to her version of events, she was basically an innocent victim who'd been deceived by a master manipulator. But here's the thing about corporate leadership. You learn to see through people's excuses pretty quickly. Melanie wasn't a victim. She was someone who'd made calculated decisions based on what she thought would benefit her most. The tears were real, but they were tears of regret about consequences, not genuine remorse about choices. She talked for almost an hour, painting Derek as a sophisticated con artist who'd fooled her completely. Never mind that she'd send me a breakup text bragging about trading up to someone more ambitious. Never mind that she'd posted Instagram stories flaunting her upgrade to a more successful man. When she finally stopped talking and asked again if we could try to work things out, I took a long sip of my coffee and really looked at her. 2 years together, and I was seeing her clearly for the first time. The Melanie sitting across from me wasn't the woman I thought I'd been dating. That woman had been an illusion. Someone who'd told me what I wanted to hear, while secretly keeping her options open for someone better. The real Melanie was opportunistic, materialistic, and perfectly willing to abandon a solid relationship for the promise of a more luxurious lifestyle. I set down my coffee cup and leaned back in my chair. The answer was no. Not just no, but absolutely not under any circumstances would I consider taking her back. She'd show me exactly who she was when she thought she had something better, and I believe her the first time. I explained that her breakup text hadn't been a mistake or a moment of weakness. It had been her true feelings about our relationship and what she thought I could offer her. The only thing that changed was Derek's ability to deliver on his promises. Melanie started crying harder, insisting that she'd learned from her mistakes, that she appreciated what we'd had together, that she'd never take me for granted again. But I'd heard enough. I told her I hoped she'd learn valuable lessons from the experience, that maybe next time she'd be more careful about burning bridges before she was certain a new path would work out. But as for us, that ship had sailed the moment she decided I wasn't good enough for her ambitions. The conversation ended with her begging me to reconsider, promising to prove she'd changed, asking for just one chance to make things right. I stood up, wished her luck with whatever came next, and walked out of that coffee shop feeling lighter than I had in months. Over the next few weeks, she tried texting, calling, even showing up at my office building. Each attempt was more desperate than the last, filled with promises about how much she'd grown and changed during their week in paradise. I blocked her number, told building security not to let her upstairs, and focused on moving forward with my life. As for Derek, I heard through the office grapevine that his parents had hired a lawyer to try negotiating a settlement with our company. Apparently, they were hoping to avoid criminal charges by paying back the fraudulent expenses and having Derek write a formal apology. Our legal team wasn't interested in deals. $8,000 in corporate fraud, plus the attempted insurance scam, plus lying on official company documents. Derek was looking at serious legal consequences that his parents' money couldn't fix. The last I heard, he'd moved back home to Orange County and was working at some retail job while dealing with his legal issues. His dreams of being a big-shot businessman had been replaced by the reality of explaining to future employers why he'd been terminated for fraud. The whole experience taught me something important about relationships and red flags. Melanie had been dropping hints about her true priorities for months. The Instagram obsession, the constant complaint about other couples' lifestyles, the subtle digs about us never doing anything exciting. I'd ignored those signs because I cared about her and thought she cared about me. But when someone shows you what really matters to them, you should pay attention. Money, status, and luxury vacations mattered more to Melanie than loyalty, honesty, or the solid foundation we've been building together. 6 months later, my life looks completely different. I'm dating someone new, Sarah, a software engineer who appreciates quiet weekends and splitting the check at dinner. She thinks my job is interesting but doesn't care about my salary or my corporate access. We talk about books and hiking trails instead of luxury resorts and designer handbags. The funny thing is, I'm happier now than I ever was with Melanie. Turns out, being with someone who wants to be with you for who you are, not what you can provide, makes all the difference in the world. So there you have it. My story about how a breakup text led to the most educational vacation two people never saw coming. What do you think about how everything played out? Was I too harsh? Or did Derek and Melanie get exactly what they deserved? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button and subscribe for more tales from corporate America. And if you've got your own workplace drama or relationship revenge stories, drop them in the comments. Who knows? Maybe your story will be featured next time.